Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to you from wherever you happen to be joining us from. And it's a great pleasure for me to be introducing my long-term colleague and friend, Dr. Anna Ponomareva. Dr. Ponomareva is originally from Russia, but she's been based in the UK for quite a number of years now, and is currently she teaches Russian practical translation from English into Russian, translation in history and comparative literature at various schools at UCL, where she is based for most of her time. However, she's also currently the acting coordinator for Russian at Imperial College London, where Russian is also taught. Anna specializes in a range of different research topics, most notably translation studies, Russian language, pedagogy, Russian symbolism, comparative literature, and the history of ideas. She also happens to be a fluent speaker of the Southern Indian language Telugu. She is also author of a number of publications in those areas, and her PhD, in fact, which she completed in 2017, was on the area on which she is going to be speaking this evening, and for her PhD, she studied the translations of what 5 contemporary, very modern translations of the great work of Russian literature, which she's going to be focusing on this evening. The title of her talk is My Appointment with Onegin, Charles Johnston, Douglas Hofstadter, and Stanley Mitchell. So I will now ask you to welcome Anna, and I will hand over to her for her talk. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Mark, for your kind introduction. And I will begin my talk. So, I think that a little bit later this evening, you will understand where from I took the title of my today's presentation. And at the moment, you can see 3 names on the title. And these 3 names represent 3 very interesting translations of Eugene Onegin. Sorry, I tried to move it. No.
Maybe you need to just click once. Now try.
Oh,
okay.
No. So first of all, a few words about the original, because obviously if Pushkin did not write his novel in verse, Eugene Onegin, we would not have an opportunity to talk about its translations into English. So in the current political climate, it's impossible now to use great adjective when we are describing Russian literature, because it looks like that in the West, there is a kind of setup initiative that there is nothing great in Russia anymore. But I decided to mention it for you to understand that it's very difficult now to communicate with people and to talk about Russian literature, because it has this unfortunate component which points to the current war between Russia and Ukraine. but I hope that only once again during my presentation, I will make a contemporary link. So when Pushkin wrote Eugene Onegin, it was again a type of new literature. And what was new about the novel? Obviously not a romantic story, but Pushkin's ideas to use the romantic story in order to tell what he thinks about his contemporary Russian society and what is going on there. And he published Eugene Onegin in literary magazines, so in a number of installments. And then on this slide, you can see, I believe, nearly the full list of existing full translations of Eugene Onegin into English. I stopped adding new translations to the list when I finished my PhD because I decided to do something else. But from time to time, I am coming to the topic of my dissertation. And you can see that in English, by 2017, there were 36 translations of Pushkin's novel. And I think that if you look at the dates of publications of these translations, you can understand that only in the 21st century, there were 13 translations. And it looks like that in order to be pass your exams to be a professional translator of Russian classical literature, you're supposed to produce your own Eugene Onegin. So the first time English-speaking audiences in Britain heard about the appearance of Eugene Onegin in 1830. So it's nearly 200 years ago, English-speaking people were confronted with information that such a novel exists. And in that article published in the Foreign Literary Gazette, there was something mentioned which I think even appropriate to use today when describe the reasons why still now in the 21st century people are interested in this piece of literature. It's first of all, it's a lovely and attractive sketch of external face of that capital, meaning St. Petersburg at that time. So loveliness, lightness, and external cultural insight into the Russian life, this make this work very attractive to English-speaking audiences and not only to English-speaking audiences. Because my other two slides are dedicated to the presence of Eugene Onegin in Chinese cultural life. The first slide says about one prominent translator of Russian classical literature from Russian into Chinese Mandarin. It is Gu Yu. And I met him 10 years ago, and he shared with me his article, from which you can see the quotation in my next slide. But on this slide, it is not information about translation. It is information about the first co-production between Mariinsky Theater and National Center for the Performing Arts in Beijing, when they produced their own Eugene Onegin 9 years ago. So this slide, sorry, I do not know Mandarin. So for me, it's difficult to check the correctness of this information, but I believe that here listed 15 versions of Eugene Onegin in Chinese. And I hope that if you're interested in this novel, you might read it later. So what kind of methodology I have chosen to use in presenting my lecture today. It is related to paratextual studies. The idea of paratext has been introduced by a French literary scholar, Gerard Genet, and it happened nearly 50 years ago, but it took 10 years to translate his book into English. And in English, it's got the following title, Paratext, Thresholds of Interpretations. And my senior colleague, with whom I work now at Center for Translation Studies at UCL, it is Professor Catherine Batchelor, developed the idea of paratexts, and she suggests that it is possible to use this methodology in evaluating translations, because the concept of paratext has its potential to influence the ways in which the text might be received. So I'm trying to show you that this is really possible, and we can find some positive outcomes of using this methodology. So you have seen on my title slide the three names, and now it's time to talk about these three translators who contributed to the ongoing tradition of introducing to English-speaking audience new versions of Eugene Onegin. So in my chosen three translators, one was a British diplomat. It is Charles Johnston. Another, and he is still alive, he is a very distinguished professor in American University at the University of Indiana. He specializes in computer science, physics, and also comparative literature. And he likes to do translations as well. In addition to Russian, he translates from Italian and French. And Stanley Mitchell, Professor Stanley Mitchell, unfortunately, he passed away 12 years ago. He was a British academic and author, and also translator, largely of Russian classical literature. All of them contributed to keeping the tradition of making Eugene Onegin alive for contemporary English-speaking audiences. And I think that my choice of these three translators can be explained by the quality of their work. I'm not going to provide any data which illustrates the richness of their translations, because, as I mentioned about a minute or two ago, my methodology is different. I'm trying to illustrate the importance of paratextual studies in translation. That's why I am going to look briefly at book covers of their publications, and then to talk about additional chapters related to their translations, either published in the same volume as their translations or appeared in press in different publications, but anyway related to their translations of Eugene Onegin. So, and now it's a chance for me to justify the importance of possessive pronoun in front of appointment in the title of my lecture today. It is why it is my appointment. And it looks like that it was one of other translators of Eugene Onegin, Walter Arndt, who was the first who spotted the use of this possessive pronoun my at the start of at the beginning of the novel, at the very last, and at the end of the novel, because the first word and the last word in Pushkin's novels are the same. And here you are able to see the quote from Douglas Hofstadter chapter, where he evaluates the previous translations of Eugene and Onegin, where he underlines Aaron's scholarly skills in evaluating the text of translation and sporting this symmetric element in Pushkin's work. So it is important, probably I'm underlining it one more time, that appropriation, first of all, it was Pushkin who created Onegin and who appropriated him, or in different words, had a very personal relationship with Onegin. And the tradition was continued by translators themselves. So I'm going to provide 3 stories of this appropriation of Pushkin's Onegin. So these 3 stories are now illustrated by 3 front covers of their book covers. And you can see Johnston volume, then you can see Hofstadter's book, and then Mitchell's translation. And if we are going to use this paratext methodology, we can see that even from book covers, a reader who is not familiar with Pushkin's text might get some information what is all about. However, these 3 book covers are extremely varied. And if Johnston book cover is just a classical cover and it does not have any illustrations, so book covers of other translators, they have images on their covers. So Hofstadter's book has an image of the Peter and Paul fortress from St. Petersburg. So this is a place from which so-called northern capital of Russia has started at the beginning of the 18th century. And again, it might be not a very traditional approach to presenting classical literature from Russia, because it has the color which is red of this book book cover, and also it has a mirror image or mirror information on the author, which is Pushkin, and on the translator, which is Hofstadter. And additionally, it is typically it is a typical characteristic of Douglas Hofstadter to use some inventions, some inventory words, or playing with words. So we can see it is not a translation, it is a versification of Pushkin's novel. And the third book cover, it has a very contemporary image, and this illustration was created by Slava Harasimovich, who won one of Victoria and Albert Museum prizes for book illustrations. And after she received the prize and award, she was given opportunities to work to create covers for Penguin Classics publishing house. So on her in her image of Onegin, we are able to see an elegant man's torso wearing a snow white shirt frill and a black tailcoat with a buttonhole in which white and red flower had been inserted. And you can see that part of the flower, which is in red, also provides probably some links to the fact that it might be interpreted as the torso is bleeding. But people who know the story can easily understand why it can be interpreted in this way. So now, after my brief explanation how book covers are different and how information presented there might contribute to the reader's understanding of translations, I am going to talk about actual paratext, because I briefly mentioned that paratext is a term which was introduced to comparative literature and then used in translation studies by Gerard Genet. And information on Johnston paratext I managed to find in Liddell Hart Center for Military Archives at the Library of King's College, London. There, it is a manuscript, which is called An Appointment with Eugene Onegin, Memoirs of a Translator. And this text provides very detailed insights on how Johnston worked on his translation and what kind of personal links he has with the text. So Johnston was a British diplomat, and his first job was in Japan. And it was at the beginning of the Second World War, and he was there working as a third secretary. And then when the war progressed, the British embassy was closed because obviously they could not work on the territory of their enemy. And the embassy staff was locked inside the building and the buildings on their territory, and they were sitting and doing nothing, waiting for the ship being sent to evacuate them. So how Johnston described the beginning of his studies of Russian is quite funny, because what happened there among the people who were sitting there, there was one Russian lady called Maria, and she decided to entertain her colleagues by introducing them introducing to them Russian. So she started to teach them Russian. And later, when Johnston got another diplomatic post, this time in Egypt, he met Natalia Bagration-Muranskaya, who had some very tight connections with Russian royal family and also Georgian royal family. And from this slide, you can see that she, as a bride, presented a very unusual present at the wedding ceremony to Johnston. It was a volume of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin. And at that time, Johnston knew Russian, but obviously in order to produce his own Onegin, which he was dreaming since 1944, he's supposed to study Russian, to master the language. And then eventually this time came when he retired from the Home Office, and in a way, working on Onegin was his methodology to accommodate himself to a new life of a retired person. And he decided to produce his translation, and first time he financially contributed to publishing his translation by himself, and then he presented this new volume to his friends, and it was his Christmas present to his friends for 1977. So Christmas was 1966, but New Year was in 1977. So this is how his work appeared. And I don't know, do I have time or not to develop my story about personal connections between Johnston, his work, and his diplomatic service, but I think that it will be necessary to mention that when the translation was ready in draft, Johnston decided to ask his friend John Balfour, who knew Russian, to look at the work, and he was really interested to know his comments. And because at some point they worked together, so Johnston knew what to expect from Balfour. So Balfour read everything with a great attention and suggested a lot of amendments of Johnston text. So again, it was done as if Balfour was reading any diplomatic documents, so it was very precisely done. So if paratext related to Johnston publication of Eugene Onegin is still unpublished and is kept in one of the archives in London, so Hofstadter's paratext is part of his volume, where is the actual text of his translation. And Hofstadter, even in addition to various chapters, introductory chapters from the translator, he also even added his translator's dedication written using Pushkin's stanza. And here, obviously, it's pointless to speak about invisibility of the translator, because Hofstadter, by suggesting that his dedication should be put in front of Pushkin, obviously thinks about himself as a person who contributes to co-creation of the novel, but this time in English. And talking about Mitchell's paratext, actually, if we apply Jeanette's terminology appropriately, it is not a paratext, because it's not before the text of the translation. It is an epitext, because epitext, it is something which is related to translation, but was published later than the appearance of the translated text. And again, here, if I started to touch the topic about the healing power of translation by mentioning that for Johnston, it was an opportunity to adjust his life to the new reality of being a retired person. I did not mention that Hofstadter probably was the most, Hofstadter used his opportunities to translate Eugene Onegin, to overcome his great loss, because he lost his young wife. She with a very severe form of cancer, untreatable. And in order to remember her, in order to remember the joy when they read together Phalen's translation of Eugene Onegin, Hofstadter decided to produce his own Eugene Onegin. And this, in a way, a tradition to develop the healing power of translation was continued by Mitchell, because here you can see in this quote that Mitchell has some mental illnesses, problems, and he decided that it will be beneficial for his health to do this translation. And probably his translation project dedicated to translating Eugene Onegin was the longest out of the three translations I'm discussing today, because he started to work on his Eugene Onegin in the middle of 60s, when Mitchell, with other colleagues at the University of Exeter, created a group. So it was at the beginning, it was a team translation project. But then eventually people from this translation group, they had their own activities. And later, Mitchell continued to produce his own work on his own. But anyway, behind Mitchell's work is a long tradition, because he was the translator of Russian classical literature. Out of the three mentioned translators, he was the most experienced one when he was doing his Eugene Onegin. Johnston, before he translated Eugene Onegin, used his mother's name and published some translations, in particular Turgenev's stories, into English. And for Hofstadter, his Eugene Onegin, still it is the only work of Russian literature which Hofstadter translated from Russian into English. So after this, I'm not going to say detailed description of book covers and some texts which can be classified as paratext. I think that I managed somehow to deliver to you information that all three translators were visible in their texts, but obviously the power of their visibility and the presence of them, they were quite varied between these three examples. But if we come back to Venuti's ideas on visibility of the translator, in a way, my study shows that my data provide a contradictory information, contradictory to Venuti's ideas. This time, it's not the author who makes translation being more attractive to the reader. It is the translator, the figure of the translator, which moves the translation process. And this is how probably readers are choosing their translations and are very happy to read new publications. And to finish my presentation, before hopefully I have some questions from the audience, I decided to give you an opportunity just to listen a very short short video which corresponds to Eugene Onegin as an opera, because Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky used the text of Pushkin's novel, and he used it for writing his own libretto and then creating music, which many people in the West familiar with. So it's difficult to say. However, I believe that it might be that Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin is more famous than the original Pushkin's novel. But it seems to me a lot of translators in particular who are working in the linguistic pair of Russian and English, I did a lot to make this novel in verse being available to English-speaking audiences. So.
Судьбу мою отныне я тебе вручаю, перед тобою слезою твоей защиты умоляю, гибнуть я должна. Я жду тебя, я жду тебя. Верим словом, надежды сердца живи, и сон тяжелый перерви, увы, заслуженный. Увы, заслуженный.
Thank you very much for your attention. So I will be very happy to hear your questions, please.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. That was really very interesting, very illuminating of the motivations and of the three translators. And one of my takeaways was the therapeutic potential of translation. It's very, very, very fascinating to hear from that point of view how it impacted the lives and the well-being of at least two of those three translators. We do have time for questions. We have a very small but select live audience actually in the room. And of course, if you're in the room and would like to ask a question, you're welcome to ask it live. Otherwise, if you have a question, you're very welcome to type it in the chat, or can people in the Zoom meeting, they can, oh yes, if you'd like to, you can raise your hand, of course, by clicking on the appropriate button, and then we will invite you in to ask your question. And we have one message of appreciation here. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I think that maybe while you are considering to phrase your question, now I am able to see, sorry, I didn't see the time, so I had impression that I covered what I planned to cover in my talk. But then I realized that I promised to provide another link to the current very sad situation related to the war between Ukraine and Russia. I need to point to the fact that when Johnston did his translation, so first publication of his work was in 1977, but because this publication was a great success, Penguin asked his permission to do reprint of his translation for the American market. And in 1979, when the situation in the world was not very peaceful, because the Soviet Union moved his troops to Afghanistan, and how a very long war between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan started. And unfortunately, my generation of people belong to this period of Soviet history because, for example, two of my classmates, because they did not manage to get a place at university and Russian military service was and still is compulsory for all young people, men who are 18. They were recruited and they took part in the Soviet-Afghan war. Luckily, they came back and they came alive. So when Johnston went to Washington for the presentation of his book, it was a very courageous from his side, because the climate was definitely anti-Soviet, but sorry to say, whenever people are saying anti-Soviet, they mean anti-Russian. And I don't think that it is the same issues. So it was anti-Soviet. So in this way, by doing this presentation, I think that for me, it is an opportunity to say that we are living in the world when people do not respect words, do not trust words, and do not use words to stop military conflicts. Unfortunately, now the only power, it is related to weapons, not to people words. And I think that unless we found great people who are very skillful in using their diplomacy and their words for peace, I think that these horrible conflicts will go on and on. So this is my interpretation of the current situation. Probably not everybody can agree with me, but I think I'm with Johnston, who strongly believe in the power of beautiful words. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from the Zoom meeting. Carnegie has raised. Here we are. You're live, Dr. Carnegie. If you'd like to jump in with your question, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting and to listen to the three, to your analysis to the three translation work. done by three translators, Eugene, Onegin. Having seen your analysis point on the paratext aspects of the analysis, it's clear that, as mentioned in your conclusion, the feasibility of the translator. But I'm interested to see if you have analysis concerning the ideology of each of the three translators. I'm sure that based on the micro-text analysis, it might be quite clear as well to see the differences of each of the translator style in terms of producing their own work. So you might see their principle, their worldview concerning the source text in their own translation version. I hope my question is quite clear. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. If I managed to understand your question correctly, you would like to know something related to the presence of ideology in translation based on these three examples. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
I think that there was no ideology there, because it is, as I said, one layer of the text. It is a romantic story. Another layer of the text, cultural insights to the Russian society of the first third of the 19th century. And I think that Pushkin wrote his Eugene Onegin in time when there was a very strict censorship. And I just mentioned that on the cover of Hofstadter's book, there is St. Paul's and Peter's bastion. So it is in a way not only how St. Petersburg has begun as a city, it is also a symbol of the Tsarist harsh regime at that time, because into this bastion, some members of the Decembrist uprisal in 1825 were put. So they were imprisoned there before being sent to Siberia to serve many years of their service. And I think that in a way, this image adds to Hofstadter's translation by providing the atmosphere in which Pushkin lived and in which his Eugene Onegin was put in. But as a text, there are some clues in particular to, for example, uprisal in Warsaw, because at that time, Poland was part of Russian Empire. But again, everything was so craftily encoded in the text. And I think that with various success of the translators managed to preserve the symbols which have been used in Pushkin's original text.
So it's a bit like, has to do with the work. If we can use the concept of covert and overt translation, it could be a bit more covert or overt translation, because it's more close to the original of the source language in terms of the target language itself.
But talking about close to the original, I did not mention it, but why at the end of my presentation I provided reference to Venuti's book on the translator's invisibility, because in my dissertation, I looked only at translations which were published after 1995, because in 1995, Venuti's book appeared on Translators' Visibility, and it marks the end of the regime that we can seriously look at any piece of literature in translation and trying to discuss how close it is to the original. Because after 1995, the translator became co-author, and this is the clear message from Lawrence Venuti's book on the translator's visibility. But Johnston's work was published before 1995. But anyway, he worked in the regime when it was necessary to compare, to show how one's translation corresponds to its original. But anyway, even in 1977, even Johnston as a diplomat and the person who knows how important is protocol, so it is a kind of diplomatic etiquette, he introduced this diplomatic etiquette of protocol issues in his translation, but he also saw himself not kind of a copyist of Pushkin's words, but a person who expropriates Pushkin's Onegin and created his own. That's why my appointment with Onegin. Okay. I don't know, did I answer your question or not, but I tried.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for explanation, and thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We do have a question in the chat and also a comment. So let me start by reading the question, and this is from Zhang Mingjie. Thank you very much, Dr. Ponomareva, for your wonderful talk. I'm quite interested in your statement of visibility of translators. Actually, Venuti has argued this in his famous book and attempted to give an open discussion on this issue. How do you consider the rationale of de-invisibility of translators? And to what extent do you think you are contrary with Venuti's opinion? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I think I can repeat what once Anthony Pym wrote. In spite of his criticism of a lot of Venuti's argument on visibility and visibility, Anthony Pym wrote, "I'm a great fan of Venuti. I'm a great supporter of Venuti's ideas." So the same is applicable to me. Whatever I'm trying to say in relationship to provide comments on Venuti's concept of visibility or invisibility, it is an opportunity to contribute to the discussion of this very important issue in translation studies. Thank you.
Thank you. And then if I just read out the comment as well from Adil Sobral. In my view, as we cannot be outside in ideology to see it from a distance, ideology is always present, but ideology is evaluation from some point of view, not necessarily a negative or disruptive thing.
Thank you very much for your comment. But what can I say? Maybe deliberately, I'm trying to avoid talking about the presence of ideology in translation. However, I added elements of ideology into my talk. So it might be contradictory. But if you think about my background, I was born in the Soviet Union. I was educated in the Soviet Union. My first degree in philosophy. So I was a student at Moscow State University in 1980, 1986. So the very last years of the existence of the Soviet Union. Obviously, it was not that strictly ideological country, how people can understand. I lived 18 years in the presence of Brezhnev in power. At that time, ideology was important, but of course, it was not that important when in comparison with the time when Stalin was in power. So when my family moved to Britain, I told myself, enough is enough. I studied Marxism-Leninism, I studied historical materialism, I studied the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and a lot of other subjects related to Marxism-Leninism philosophy. And I decided that if I change the country, I'm supposed to change my attitude. And that's how I am trying to avoid discussing ideology. But sometimes, obviously, I could not be silent on that topic. So I am not denying the presence of ideology in any literary work, but simply it's not, say, my paradigm of approaching literature and translation at the moment. Thank you.
Anyone? Oh, there's a follow-up from Adel Sobral. Thanks a lot. Oh, sure. Of course, it depends on the background. But now we have a question from Xu Tianzong. Thank you very much for your sharing, Dr. Ponomareva. I am very interested in the paratextual analysis in your research. I have one question regarding the methodology. How do you include two scholars' viewpoints in your methodology? These two scholars have some different perspectives on paratexts. For example, Jeannette separates paratexts as inside or outside the book, whereas Batchelor avoids specifying where the paratext should be placed. How did you handle problems like these in your research? Many thanks.
Thank you very much for this question. When Jeannette wrote his work on paratext, he wrote it for comparative literature. And obviously, when this concept took their roots in comparative literature studies and then moved, got attention from scholars of different studies of literature, because I believe that in a way translation is a study of literature as well. So I think that my colleague, Professor Batchelor, I think that she simply used Jeannette's ideas, maybe not all of them, and I do not think that she in a way somehow contradicts to original concept expressed by Jeannette, but simply she applies some of them to the study, to translation studies. And Jeannette's original ideas, they were not designed for translation studies. Thank you.
Okay, does anybody else have a question that you'd like to ask, either on the chat or if you'd like to raise your hand? Ask it in person, you'd be most welcome. All right, so it seems as if we've come to the end of questions. So let me thank Dr. Ponomareva once more for a really fascinating talk. And we have a small token of our great appreciation for you, which I hope you'll
okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.